Okay, good day to everybody, wherever you are around the world. My name is Chris McMonagle. I'm going to guide us through today. I work with Bechtel, but I've had the honor of chairing the working group with the IHA on de-risking pump storage. I'm going to give everybody just another few seconds to see the numbers rolling in, just to make sure we get everybody dialed in. While we wait, I will tell you that whenever you look to launch an event like this, you always wonder how many people will join. We can tell you that amongst the session, we have this first session, another session later today, we have over 800 people registered, which is absolutely fantastic. And if anything tells you about the appetite for pump storage, the appetite for this market, and really looking to make a difference. So it's a very hot topic, which is fantastic. Okay, I see numbers increasing rapidly. So maybe if we could flip to the next slide, I will take you through for a second on the agenda. So in a second, I will introduce Malcolm Turnbull, who will give us an introductory message. Then with myself and Rebecca from IHA, we will talk you through the genesis of the project and the guidance note, which is being launched today. Then we're very fortunate to have three of the working group members where we'll have a roundtable discussion and then open up for Q&A. I encourage you to start putting questions into the chat. Questions will come through the chat only. There's no facility today for hands up and people to ask questions directly. So please come in with questions. Here's our group. You will see. So again, you'll start to see Joaquin, Helen, and Roddy in the Q&A a bit later, and again Rebecca from IHA. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Malcolm Turnbull. Many, if not all of you, will obviously know ex-Prime Minister of Australia, a huge advocate of pumped storage, and our president of the IHA. So I'm very pleased to have you here, Malcolm, today. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I hope it's my advocacy that is huge, not me, because I'm obviously struggling to maintain my slim, boyish figure. Look, I want to welcome you all to the launch of this vital guidance note to support and drive investments in pumped storage hydropower. And as you've just heard, it's been brought to us via a partnership between the International Hydropower Association and Bechtel, and an extended working group, including colleagues from around the world and, of course, from here in Australia. Now, let me say, pumped hydro is the key to a successful energy transition. We are simply not going to get to 11,000 gigawatts of renewable capacity in an effective way without storage. The reality is that the key is to replace burning fossil fuels with renewable generation. And renewable generation, the fastest growing types of renewable generation are solar and wind. Solar alone is growing at more than 20% a year. There's never been a technology that has grown globally at the pace it is. Now, if we move into a world where we have no thermal generation, we will, in fact, other than in places where they have nuclear power and huge, hydropower systems, as you see, for example, in North America and in parts of Asia, you're not going to have very much continuous generation, if any at all. Here in Australia, you'll have no continuous generation. So storage is going to make those renewables possible. And moreover, if you're in your energy mix, you end up with more solar relative to wind than you'd originally contemplated, you're going to need even more storage, because obviously the solar radiation is highly correlated longitudinally in a way that wind is not. So the bottom line is we need long duration storage, and only pumped hydro can deliver that. So it's absolutely the key. Now, this is, I have been talking passionately about this for a long time now, but the penny really dropped for me in 2016 when, as the Australians will remember, there was a massive blackout, a statewide blackout in the state of South Australia. And look, it wasn't the fault of wind and solar, it wasn't the fault of variable renewables, but what it did underpin to me was that in that state where continuous generation had by and large closed down because of the growth of renewables, and they had been depending on gas peakers to some extent, but in large part from support via an interstate connection, which was damaged in the course of the storm. What it underlined to me was that we needed to have that long duration storage to make renewables reliable. And, and to basically to be able to deliver the continuous generation that our societies demand. And so I got interested in pumped hydro, and out of that developed a pumped hydro agenda in this country, and of course Snowy Hydro 2.0, which is going to be one of the largest pumped hydro schemes in the world and is currently under construction in the Snowy Mountains. But, Snowy Hydro 2.0, magnificent though it is not nearly enough, and it's only one project, and it's very specific because it involves connecting well over 20 kilometres of waterway to enormous existing reservoirs, which have an elevation difference of about 700 metres. Now, most pumped hydro schemes, as we'll hear later today, are very different to that, and either involve building a new reservoir on top of a hill next to an existing one, or perhaps building two new reservoirs as close together as possible, but separated obviously by substantial or meaningful elevation. But the problem we face is that the energy market, particularly markets like ours in Australia that are energy only markets, struggle to work out how to price long duration storage, because you're not, if you're talking about a short-term storage system like a battery, it's fairly straightforward. You charge during the middle of the day when solar energy is cheap, and discharge in the early evening when prices go up. But we need to be able to have to support our energy system in the renewable world. We need to have long duration storage that goes for many hours, even days, and we need to have storage that will not be charged and discharged every day like a battery may be. So how do we price that? How do we support that? Well, obviously, every market, every jurisdiction has got to work out how much long duration storage it needs, and then it's got to find, unless the government's going to build it all, find a competitive way of ensuring you get the right, the best value for consumers. But we have to get on with it. We really have to get on with it. It is, Moore's law does not apply to digging holes. This stuff takes time. Solar panels, you can roll them out very quickly. Wind, perhaps not so quickly, but pumped hydro, simply because of the civil works, requires a lot of work. It's already the largest single form of energy storage in the world, with nearly 200 gigawatts installed capacity. It's providing already 90% of all stored long duration energy across the world. So how do we get cracking on this? The IHA has been, promoting this issue, as we should. We are the International Hydropower Association, and working with Bechtel and the colleagues that are going to speak to us tonight, been looking at how we de-risk pumped hydro projects, because we need to get on with them. We need to get on and build them. There's plenty planned, but apart from China, there isn't nearly enough being built. So, I want to welcome the efforts of the working group in developing this very eloquent but succinct guidance note on how to de-risk investment for pumped storage projects. And by reading this guidance and having regard to it, new market entrants will be better able to understand the risks and develop a mitigation strategy to address them. So, speaking to you as president of the IHA, a person who's supported pumped storage in government and now is heading a very capable team in developing 2 large pumped hydro projects in Australia as a developer, I'm saying to you, this is my passion. I hope it's yours. I know it's the working groups, but without it, without pumped storage hydropower on a very large scale, the energy transition will fail. We can't afford it to fail. We've only got one planet, and this is the key to protecting it. So thank you very much, and I look forward to, Chris, to you introducing the working group to discuss the paper. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Malcolm, for those words. So we're going to move on now to Rebecca Ellis. And I want to say a big thank you to Rebecca. Rebecca has been absolutely pivotal to everything that has been done with this guidance note. It is not easy corralling the thoughts of 20 different companies over nearly a year. And so again, thank you to Rebecca for keeping us sane, keeping us together, and coming up with, as Malcolm said, a very concise, eloquent note. Rebecca, over to you.
Well, thank you all, and couldn't have done it without everyone in the working group and beyond. And I'll talk more about that shortly and about why this is hopefully going to be a guidance note for all of industry to use. So please, next slide. So those of you who, probably most of you already know what pumped storage hydropower is, but for those of you who may not, who are joining the call to find out more about pumped storage hydropower, just very quickly, there are two types, closed loop and open loop, or wherein one is situated on a river, similar to a conventional hydropower source, and the other is off the river or a closed loop, and will have a less significant natural inflow. So just very quickly, wanted to just cover that very quickly. Next slide, please. And just to call out what Malcolm was talking about, yes, there's this fantastic tripling up renewables pledge at COP28. World leaders did commit to this, and we hope to see much more ambitions on this. But meeting the target will require much more conventional hydropower, renewable energy generation, as well as that fantastic pumped storage hydropower, rechargeable water batteries to support all this fantastic solar and wind that we are hopefully going to see in the coming decades. Next slide, please. But as Malcolm pointed out, there are going to be huge needs for ramping up and ramping down. As you'll see, there's huge amounts of solar that changes hourly and that will change daily. And this is where we see the evolution of pumped storage hydropower and that long duration, large capacity energy storage. So just to provide a little bit of facts, along with the fantastic points that Malcolm just made. So that evolution of pumped storage hydropower that we've already seen over the past few decades. And we'll continue to see that important evolution. And this introduces the question of why isn't more being built? So next slide, please. So Chris.
Yeah, so thanks, Rebecca. So I'd like to take us back probably around 12 months on the genesis of this working group. The starting hypothesis flows from everything you've heard today, which is long duration storage, or rechargeable water batteries, as we like to say in the market. They're just critical. It's a fundamental part of the solution. However, many of us in industry see two pretty big problems. One, not enough projects are getting into construction. And therefore, as we've heard, it takes a long time to develop these projects. It takes a long time to build these projects. And therefore, the storage capacity will not be available when the grid needs it. We need to get more projects through final investment decision and into construction. And then the industry has a second problem, which is in the broader hydropower industry. Research tells us that there is a considerable risk of cost and schedule overrun. And unless we can sort that out as an industry, we will lose the confidence of investors, of governments, and of supply chain. Therefore, people will not want to get involved in these projects. So the view was industry needs to do better. We need to think about, it's too important to fail, how do we improve? So we then had a chat with the IHA and said, okay, this needs an industry approach. This needs a broad group of people from across the world to come together to think about this. And so we pulled together around 20 organizations, and very purposefully we have coverage across engineers, contractors, and the turbine suppliers. We have lawyers, we have academics, we have policymakers, investors, developers, a real broad spectrum of different approaches and our different organizations. And also from all across the world, because each jurisdiction operates slightly differently. We then spent time as a group looking at all of the problems the market faces against these, with the underlying issues against these two fundamental problems. What are the areas we can truly influence? And then most importantly, what are the recommendations we want to make? we took a very early on in discussion, this very important point I'd like to make, where the group did a fantastic job about deciding we're not looking to de-risk pump storage from any one individual's point of view or one organization's point of view. Of course, one person having less risk means another takes more risk. This is not about each individual company. This is about how do we de-risk the project. And again, I thank the team for putting their organizational views to the side and thinking of what is right for industry. So a very healthy debate across the multiple time zones and coming up with the recommendations. We thought hard about who is this note for, and what I'll say is it's not a detailed toolkit for how to develop a project. That exists in different places. The guidance note is very much around, really for key decision makers. As we're setting up projects at the outset, what are the big decisions that need to be made at the resurgence of this really important market? So again, we encourage people to look at what are the recommendations, which I think in some circumstances are different to how some current owners and developers have looked at projects in other sectors. Okay? So, please bear that in mind. Please look at the guidance note, and Rebecca will take us through a little bit of some of the high level recommendations that are being made, and then we'll have a discussion with some of the working group members. That's a bit of the history. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that fantastic overview. Next slide, please. So just to kind of cover a little bit more in detail, so some of our objectives for this project was we wanted to provide that platform for discussions on de-risking investments for PSH projects. And as Chris touched on, we very much were focusing on how to de-risk the project rather than for one individual stakeholder or another. I should also note, while we could have focused on many different types or gone into a lot more granularity in terms of, we've focused on greenfields. There may have to be additional considerations if you are looking to rehabilitate an existing asset, e.g. a dam or another brownfield site. So just to note that up front. And we also wanted to gain further insights and views of the issues beyond the working group. So we actually held a workshop after some preliminary discussions at our World Hydropower Congress. And there's some fantastic photos taken from that workshop there, where we discussed some of the high level risks that people were seeing from across industry. And we also brought in external stakeholder review to make sure that as we were developing the guidance note, that this aligned with broader industry and how they were feeling. But this is very much something we want industry to use. So we welcome further exchanges and discussion to gain your insights and views. And as part of this, we wanted to take all those fantastic discussions on risks, on those recommendations for how you might mitigate across 3 thematic areas, and created, it's a brief document. It's only 40 odd pages, which in our industry is relatively brief as far as guidance notes go. And it provides some high level good practice insights. And outside of the document, we also have an annex document, which will provide links and references to technical documents, which I'll touch on in a bit. But our last objective, but not least, is raising awareness of issues facing pumped storage hydropower development. And we will use the guidance note to further bring awareness of the issues facing PSH and how we might be able to overcome this. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction. So it introduces the concept of PSH to those who may not be familiar. We also look at the risks critical to consider when you're developing a project. Just for pumped storage hydropower, there was a lot of nuanced discussion around what those might be and how it might differ from conventional hydropower. And we also covered a sort of path of a project or a sort of high level timeline. And this is very high level, as each timeline will have to be unique and uniquely set based on the site considerations. Next slide, please. So as I said, risks for pumped storage hydropower projects. So these are some of the high level risks that a pumped storage hydropower site, and much of the initial conversations we were looking at was, how does pumped storage hydropower differ from conventional hydropower? How does it differ from other types of energy storage? And so this is a short list, as it were, of the key considerations for risks that may impact a pumped storage hydropower project in particular. And definitions of these risks can be found in the glossary section of the guidance note. Next slide, please. And as I noted, so this is a very high level project timeline for pumped storage hydropower project. And it includes, for example, where you might also want to consider applying the principles from our colleagues over at the Hydropower Sustainability Alliance and the Hydropower Sustainability Standard. So they have a new tool out, the Hydro Select, which will hopefully help stakeholders consider key issues around environmental and sustainable governance practices, as well as preparation of and applications for Hydropower Sustainability Standard if projects want to go. And we would encourage all projects to be done in a sustainable manner. It also includes sort of that, and we did this timeline based on those 3 thematic areas, which I'll cover shortly. So that project development, allocation of risk, and markets and revenues. So kind of considering what are the key activities based on those 3 thematics that you may need to be considering at these different stages of site identification, feasibility, design development, and delivery implementation. And there are some things that will also continue into operations, but we recognize that that was slightly out of our scope, but there are definitely things that should be considered in operation. And I should note as well that one of the key recommendations is designing for operations to make sure that, and that was actually a risk we identified as well, is making sure that projects, when they are being considered, are being designed for the longer life, which is the operation life. So next slide, please. So yes, as I noted, there are 3 thematic areas. We couldn't touch on everything, but we wanted to focus on some sort of 3 areas in particular. So we discussed that 3 critical areas that would really help to enable pumped storage hydropower investment are markets and revenues, sort of those areas of project development from inception all the way through implementation. And last but very much not least, that allocation of risk, especially around contracting. Next slide, please. So on markets and revenues, much of our discussions noted that the International Forum on Pumped Storage Hydropower, for which we were grateful to have Malcolm as a co-chair, the recommendations from that are still very sound in that we still need policymakers to engage with the market and support, where necessary, tailored support mechanisms for pumped storage hydropower and ensuring clarity on those policy timelines and setting energy storage targets. Even just an energy storage target can make a huge difference in how PSH projects are able to deliver. And since the International Forum, we have seen some incredible announcements from governments, and I hope to see many more. But it's really critical that policymakers and project developers, when performing economic comparisons, really focus on that long life time that PSH is. It's one of the longest asset lifetimes of an energy storage technology, and making sure that the economic comparison doesn't base on short term. And so there's a number of considerations within the risks and recommendations that cover both policymakers, but also what industry can do to support good policy implementation. And next slide, please. So as part of the guidance note, we noted that it would be helpful to guide readers with some key thematic questions. So for each of the thematic areas, there are some questions that the reader may wish to consider, and that will help guide them as they're thinking through these risks and recommendations. So for markets and revenues, we noted that considering the market and business case upfront and developing an initial economic analysis would be very, very helpful when developing your project. And looking at what does the grid need now and how would a PSH asset address that need is fundamental when setting up your business case. And as projects can take many years from the initial business case to actually commencing, considering when the project is ready to operate, what will the project be offering to the market in terms of energy services? So thinking of that upfront will be very helpful. And looking at identifying market mechanisms that could provide revenue, and considering what will be required by financiers or lenders. So next slide, please. For our project development, some of our key considerations really focused on considering procurement strategies early in the process. So procurement is very, very critical. But one of the things we noted was that if a project developer is considering its team earlier, that means that there's more touch points for where they can work together to de-risk the project. And that became the critical focus point, is that considering a procurement strategy and considering having skilled experts talking together to hopefully solve these big problems and investing in that development. We recognize that it's a huge risk to take on, but the more you invest in the actual development, the less risk there might be in the longer time and in the end rather. And specialist expertise of the delivery teams will definitely help that. Next slide, please. So as part of these key thematic questions, the questions we would want a reader to consider for this area are, do you understand the big site-specific risks for your project? Geological, subsurface conditions, topographic, hydrological, labor and equipment availability, et cetera. So are you considering those site-specific? As we noted a few times, each site will be very unique. And also considering when and what expertise do you need to bring in to address these risks? Are you engaged with the right project stakeholders, especially local communities, investors, and planning? And how can risks or challenges associated with these conditions be addressed? So understanding those risks specific to your project and investing in the key activities can help to best deliver well-coordinated project through well-coordinated project teams rather. Next slide, please. And on our allocation of risk key considerations, we looked at parties needing to be clear that the balance of risk will be different in PSH projects and in other sectors. Many who are coming to PSH may have experience in other types of energy, but risk is going to be done in a different way to PSH than in a wind or solar project. So it's key to consider that. And procurement and contract management should ensure that fair, transparent, economically most advantaged conditions of the project. And the contracting strategy should reflect and foster environmental and sustainability aspects of the project as well. Next slide, please. Allocation of risk. So considering where the risk will sit and how the delivery team will think about the cost and schedule. So there's lots of more questions actually in the guidance note itself. We had to kind of curtail this one a little bit, but what is the delivery and commercial model associated in procurement strategy? What responsibility does the owner assume in respect of any designs, plans, and how can the contractor rely on this information? And so making sure that the information is transparent where possible. Is the contract based on well-known standard form of contract? Is there a 1 or 2 stage procurement process? And that gets to that thinking of procurement early enough. And next slide, please. So these are just some of the conclusions, but I would very much encourage everyone here to read. There's a huge list of risks and recommendations, and that formed the critical component of our discussion, was really focused on risks and recommendations and how we might mitigate those for each of those three thematics. So I'd really encourage you. They're very text heavy, hence they're not on the slides. But some of our key conclusions are, the private sector, especially in liberalized markets, we're ready to deliver. We want to make sure that these are public sector enabled. So setting energy storage targets, providing helpful in terms of market mechanisms to procure energy storage, and making sure that that's really, really critical, as Malcolm identified at the first. PSH is at the more complex end of infrastructure development. So we need to invest in project development to de-risk. And the more you invest in preparation, the more the de-risk the project can become. And good project management, as I'm sure many will agree, is good risk management. So ensuring well-coordinated teams to support interface risk mitigation will be really, really critical, as PSH has a number of interfaces across all of our fantastic supply chain. So, and development of the right delivery and commercial model, we recognize that risk should be minimized by those best placed to manage, and residual risk should be shared by those best able to bear it. And that's kind of thinking more about, okay, how can we really de-risk the project? So those were some of our critical considerations that came out of many, many discussions. But I'll hand over to the working group so you can hear more about it. So over to you, Chris, for our fantastic working group.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So there's a question which came in which said, there's a lot of information here, it's hard to keep up. What I would say there is, apologies for that. Of course, this is an introduction, it's a teaser. All of the detail is in the note. And really we're just trying to give a little bit of a guide as to what is in there. Great. So I'll have a bit of discussion now. So I said, we have representation now from the design owners, engineer side, a contractor side, and the legal side with Helen, Roddy, and Joaquin. So delighted to have the three of you here. Before we move into that, again, I see some questions coming in. Please keep them coming. We won't get through all the questions, but it is hugely valuable for us, because we have discussed as a group that this probably needs to be a live document, and we may look at revising it in about 6 months' time once we get more feedback from industry. So even if we don't get your questions today, it is very relevant and helpful to us. Great. So maybe if we drop the slides, please. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Roddy. Thanks, Joaquin, for joining. We thought we'd kick off with a question on when IHA put out the call saying who wants to get involved, noting it is a chunk of time with difficult time zones. We're going to ask you to commit. I'm intrigued, and if you could share with the group why you personally, professionally, corporately, we're keen to get involved. Maybe Helen, you can kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I'd just like to start by saying thank you very much to Rebecca and Chris for chairing us over the last year. You brought together a fantastic group of people, all of which have been really important in developing a really well-rounded guidance note. From my perspective, in recent years, we've seen many pumped hydro projects start off with a lot of promise, but stall before achieving a successful FID. And that's often due to a lack of hydropower development experience. And around the world, in many locations, hydropower has not been developed for 20, 30, 40 years. So there's a bit of a deficit of experience and guidance amongst developers and operators and contractors. And given the urgency of achieving net zero and reducing global warming, we can't afford to expend time and effort on projects that don't move into execution for a variety of reasons. So from my perspective, providing developers, proponents, policymakers with access to guidance that helps them to overcome the obstacle was really, my main reason for joining, I guess. The working groups allowed me to contribute to guiding those stakeholders towards more successful and better project outcomes, which is, I hope, the outcome of this guidance note. And as you say, many iterations to come as well. It's a working document, and obviously the IHA wants to stay current. And as hopefully things develop in the market, we'll continue to update this note. Thanks, Chris.
Super. And Roddy, as a Scotsman, you have a personal and professional view on pumped storage. Your view of getting involved.
No, definitely. I mean, professionally, the market is quite cyclical in very long terms. It's 40 years ago since we were last going through kind of major hydro developments in Scotland. We're now, because the grid is changing, we're having to look at long duration storage, and pumped storage hydro is coming back into the core of the market. And so professionally, it's the time to get involved. So it was a kind of no-brainer professionally to come in. Personally, though, I'm based in the Scottish Highlands, and we've got, within a easy working commute, I can get to the sites of 5 or 6 of the new sites that are under development. So this kind of sector is really important to my community, as personally. So it's really important that these schemes work, but also work in a way that's good for us all, including those in whose communities these developments take place in. So it's just been great. It's been good fun. The working group has been I've learned a lot from the really intelligent, experienced people that are on the team. So thanks again.
Thanks. And Joaquin, a good global perspective. Athiona, your view about getting involved.
Yeah. Good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks, Chris and the IHA, for this opportunity and coordinating the group during this intense year, I would say. I joined my colleagues with the thoughts on why taking part in this working group was important. As we have seen around the world, worldwide, there's a boom in terms of pumped storage, and the need is crystal clear for us. And as Acciona, as a contractor, we have taken this initiative as a great opportunity to bring closer the different parties, exchange our thoughts on how to approach and try to minimize or mitigate the risk that we have seen around the world in different projects with different clients in different countries. And I think it's a way to participate and collaborate in order to contribute for a cleaner energy future. That I think is one of our DNA in Acciona, sustainability, and try to bring a cleaner energy future for everyone.
Great, thanks. And maybe I'll continue with you. We spoke a bit in the group around how we think the note should be used. What next for the people on the call, or for you as someone in the industry? How do you anticipate you using the note or advising others to use the note?
Yeah, so these guidance note, as you can see, once we are different parties involved with different thoughts and different challenges and objectives. So the idea is to be a valuable resource for different stakeholders, investors, engineers, as you were saying at the beginning, developers, governments. So it's a global note, let's say it like that. So it's not focusing one portion of the job, but we are seeing the pump hydro space as a whole. So in summary, we have tried to build it as a comprehensive reference to inform and to be a decision making, fostering collaboration among the different stakeholders in the pump hydro sector, because due to its specificness.
Great, thank you. Helen, your view on, you spend a lot of time talking to developers at the very early stage of projects. How do you see the note being used?
Yeah, thanks. What I liked about the guidance note is it really did acknowledge the fact that there's now a lot of pumped hydro being developed in liberalised markets by private developers, whereas perhaps historically there may have been more projects developed and undertaken by government or quasi-government organisations with a different risk appetite and ability to underwrite project risks and overruns. As you opened with the acknowledgement that these are highly complex projects with a history of financial overruns, and so starting with that in mind, quite often when we're in these early development projects, we might say, we need policymakers to do this, or we need the lawyers to do that, and we suddenly had all of those people in the room, and we're able to sort of bounce these ideas and come to a central point when we were discussing the various risks in those three areas. So from my perspective, I thought it was a great baselining of a lot of information. It sort of, I think it outlines the roles and responsibilities of each of the stakeholders involved, proponents, markets, consultants, operators. So just ensuring that they each play a crucial part in the development process. And I thought, the clear structured pathway that the guidance note has indicated helps align, efforts and actions. So I think it's a really valuable resource for efficiently and effectively developing pumped hydro projects and hopefully ultimately enhance the success rates. So it was great to be involved and looking forward to continuing to update and be involved as this goes forward.
Super, thanks. And Roddy, any different perspective there, how you'll use it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the working group's a bit of a microcosm of the industry generally. So, we all work in the industry, but we all come from our own wee silos. So we've got like geotech engineers, we've got contractors, we've got, even lawyers. We all know what we want to achieve, and we all know why we want to achieve it. But I think what is often lost is lack of visibility on what other people are needing to achieve. So the advantage of the guidance note is that everybody, lots of different sectors have inputted into this guidance note, and the whole big picture is there. Doesn't provide all the answers, but it does sort of flag all the questions, or most of the questions. So it allows people who are coming at it from a very specialist background to have a much bigger picture of what the issues are for other sectors, or other sort of stakeholders in the process. So it's good to set the scene in terms of big picture and helping you understand where other people are coming from when you're coming into a project.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as I've spoken to, again, early stage developers, owners, teams, and they're coming up with their strategy, I've had people say to me, I know this is the right way to go, but I can't convince my board because that's not the way we've done it previously. And I think this is therefore a really valuable tool to say this is not the opinion again of one person or one organization. So hope, we failed if it's not a tool, but then those people can help think about it at the earliest stage. And so that cross-sector approach we will say it many times, I think is really fundamental. And then in terms of, what would, Rod, again, I'll continue through, what might be the one, interesting recommendation or risk that's in the report that's, jumped out at you that you'd share with the group?
So, jumping back to what I was saying about, being a local to the area where a lot of these projects are happening in Scotland, I think it's what there's some really obvious construction risks and obvious finance risks to these projects. But I think what can sometimes be lost by the engineers who are sitting in their design offices or the financiers who are looking at the sums is how these things will actually impact upon communities. And of course, if it doesn't work logistically because there's not enough road infrastructure or other infrastructure, then the projects just won't work. So in order for them to work, you need to have local government coming in with all the sort of bits that are unrelated to digging holes in the ground to pump water through, things like roads, bridges, and even housing and even education for people's families. All these things need to come together, which means you need to have the community to buy in, so the local governments say this is a priority. We do need to make these things work, and add into the bigger picture in terms of the infrastructure. So I think it was quite important for me to have that in the guidance note, as much as looking at the markets, how we do cap and floor, looking at geotech risks. There's there are other things as well that were important to be picked up on.
Great, thanks. And Helen, big takeaway for you?
Oh, look, coming from a geotech background, I've observed ground risk being, appropriately or inappropriately managed in construction contracts for a number of years. Recently I've got a picture today from site Snowy 2.0 that Malcolm was discussing earlier, showing that, the trace of a 63mm wide borehole exposed in the blast face of an excavation, which is a very vivid depiction of how much information that you have to work with at the very beginning and how much assumption there is in 2 and 3 dimensions in the ground. So, in tunneling and dam projects, we understand the importance of collaborative contracting and having, extensive geotechnical information. But this isn't always the case in the early hydropower development cycle. And so it's crucial to really appropriately allocate risk in contracts, and understand that the residual risk profile is there and needs to continuously be informed by more information. So I think determining the correct contracting model often arises a little late in the development cycle, with developers frequently seeking feedback from market. But from the start of a project, I think it's really essential to understand the overall complexity and select appropriate contract frameworks that will ensure that boards, as you mentioned, insurers and financiers are comfortable with the approach from the outset. And that's often overlooked in the early feasibility stages. I think this guidance note, with the input from experts like Roddy, aims to provide a clear guidance on this issue, and help stakeholders make informed decisions and manage their risks effectively. So that was my takeaway.
Super, thanks. And Joaquin, yours is different?
As a contractor, I cannot avoid which are during the construction phase, all the risks and it's it's a particularly critical phase of the project, involving cost, really high cost and uncertainties once we start to build the job. And there are some technical risks up front, like poor design or having an inadequate site investigation, geotechnical surprises that normally happen, inadequate planning, and the lack of coordination or the lack of experience, or not having well-defined the scope of work, and interfaces across the different project areas can increase the cost and produce project delays. So my recommendation would be to have in place a risk assessment and develop a realistic cost estimate, also implementing a project management and can mitigate those cost overruns and the delays. But as a paramount recommendation, I would say investing in an early planning. What I have seen in other projects around the world is that normally the early planning is the short-term period of the project, and it would be the biggest, and put in place proactive measures. And what is more important, because there's a lack of experience and specialized people in this area, in this pump hydro space, is to have earlier specialized resources to manage the risks. That would be my recommendation.
Thanks. And there's a, link to that a little bit, a key takeaway for me, which we discussed at length, was when you bring that team together. And there's a chart in the guidance note, which many will be familiar with, which is a cost influence curve, which is you have the greatest ability to influence the outcome of the project at the earliest stages of the project. And it's a kind of a rule of thumb in industry that the more complicated a project is, the earlier you should have one delivery team working on it. A very straightforward project, you can bring the delivery team in late. And for all the reasons we mentioned at the start of the call, pumped storage sits at that more complicated end, and therefore, driving that strategy to get that one team working together, and that one team includes the owner, the designer, the constructor, the turbine provider, and various others. There is a trade-off against procurement, which was mentioned, and again, that is around you still should have a procurement, but a procurement driven more on early stage capability to get that one team working. That's a key recommendation coming out. Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you for that, team. So we have a bunch of questions coming in, which is really helpful. Thank you for that. Malcolm, as we had you watching for a while, I might get you to actually, there's a first question coming in that I know you'll have opinion on, maybe Helen as well. There's a question talking about LTESA in New South Wales, and it says, while government funding mechanisms for long duration storage like the LTESA are welcome, they inherently favor other technologies such as batteries. And often the geotech risk is unquantified, and therefore project CapEx is unable to be firmed for the LTESA process. What can we do to convince governments to change the process, recognizing the challenges that are unique to pumped storage projects? Malcolm, if you think about this a lot.
Yeah, no, I do, and we've certainly made submissions to the government about this. You're absolutely right. There needs to be support for, if you like, the development side of pumped hydro. There has been a grants program in New South Wales, but I think there needs to be more of that. And we also have to recognise that long duration storage is not anything over 8 hours, let alone, as some people in the battery sector would suggest, anything 4 hours. You need, and the latest, I answered one of the other questions earlier about this, the latest AEMO ISP, Integrated System Plan, does set out, what it regards as the likely demands of the likely storage requirements in the NEM, and, with breaking it up between short-term storage, typically, home batteries, and medium-term storage and long-term storage. But when you look at the assumptions that are being made, they are placing an enormous reliance. And I'm looking for the Australians who've got access to this page 67 in particular. You're looking at enormous reliance on coordinated, household batteries, coordinated CER, is the Consumer Energy Resources, is the acronym. I'm very skeptical about that. Very, very skeptical. It's unverified, and you won't know until it actually happens whether it's going to work or not. Common sense, and I say this as someone who's run a government. Prudent governments are going to err on the side of having more storage than less. So I think you've got the position you've got to start at is work out how much long duration storage you need for what sort of time periods, and then make sure that your process supports it. So I think the LTESA was actually world leading as a policy, but I don't think it's delivering support for the long duration storage we need. It's also too focused on 2030, which, I mean, you know, that's, and the federal government's taking the same approach, and I get it. Politicians have targets, you know, 2030 target, etc. But that's, you know, that's, we've got to be looking at, we should be looking at least 10 years ahead and more in terms of planning our long duration storage requirements, because these projects can easily take a decade from conception to completion, as we all know, if not more.
Great, thank you. Helen, anything you want to add to that? Should I move on? Another question?
Yeah, I'd just say that, you know, pumped hydro's value is in sitting there and not playing in the ancillary market as well, and to be valuable backup storage in the time of significant events in our grid, which may take out significant parts of our grid. Climate change is making those events more frequent, more unpredictable and larger. And when we're in the warm-up session, Malcolm was talking about the blackouts in South Australia in 2016, and while he was you know, in charge of the country here, and how that really highlighted the vulnerability of those future energy mixes. So we talk about generation mixes, and our storage mix is very flat at the moment. It's very reliant on batteries. And of course, we think about overall sustainability as well at the International Hydropower Association, and batteries absolutely have their place in the world, but they do need to be replaced regularly, and there are finite resources in the globe as well. So talking about you know, large capacity, long duration, but also assets that have a very long life cycle as well, and are very reliable once they're built. That tail end of value is really important, and that long life value is not really recognized currently. So yeah, seeing that change would be wonderful and very welcomed.
Great, thanks. There are a few questions which talk a bit about, can pumped storage be financially viable compared to battery storage? You know, what can we do to make the industry attractive to investors? And how do we convince governments around the, you know, putting together the right support mechanisms? What I was there saying, and I'll open it up to anybody who'd like to comment. In the markets and revenue section of the report, we were very conscious that we can't make a firm recommendation on what any one country or jurisdiction should do, because everybody needs to take what's happening in the US or Canada or UK or Australia or others or India, they're all taking a slightly different approach. But what we can do is we have spoken about what we think that approach needs to entail, which is clarity. A lot of it comes back to real clarity and engagement with industry about understanding most projects around the world are not going to be government driven. Therefore, in a liberalized market, it will be private sector led, but public sector enabled. So very open dialogue between the private and the public sector to understand what is the gap in the risk there where public sector can step in. Private sector will take an appropriate amount of risk, but where, particularly around, you know, revenue protection, major inflationary price shocks, very significant unforeseen costs, that is where government can step in. And we're seeing some fantastic work. Again, you know, examples in Australia, you know, Roddy mentioned cap and floor, and that will come out. So clarity is super important there. Anything else the group would like to comment on that, Roddy?
Yeah, I was going to say, so, you know, there was a specific question about whether cap and floor will be enough to make projects viable. You know, I think that kind of guaranteed sort of level of payment from government to top up may well be helpful. But I think much more fundamentally than that, PSH or pumped storage hydro is not purely generation. It is storage and it's generation. And I think it's that value in terms of balancing the grid, taking the peaks and the troughs and sort of leveling them out, there needs to be a value to that. So yes, you know, you need to have an income in through potentially income through cap and floor, but the value to the grid in terms of leveling out the peaks and troughs has to be recognised somewhere as well, and that needs to be you know, there needs to be some sort of financial incentive to that as well. How that then gets translated into a particular jurisdiction will hugely depend upon how the market is set up, how the you know, what the regulatory framework is. So there isn't a one size fits all for the entire planet. But there is. But I think part of the key is actually recognizing that it's not just any old sort of generation thing. It's a generation, but it's also storage.
Yeah, I agree. And in the guidance note, we do talk about those different revenue streams, and just to address a point, there's a few questions around competing with batteries. You know, we need both in our grids. You know, we need batteries to provide the short up to potential medium-term storage. Pumped storage serves a different need. And as we talk about long duration storage, I think it's important in the industry, we do separate those and we look at the grid, the need, and you know, pumped storage absolutely is a competitive solution in that longer duration market. So I don't think it's not an either or discussion. There's a good question, Joaquin and Helen, I think, you know, you can comment on. There's a top question, which is, what about the risk of finding qualified, competent consultants and contractors to do the design and construction of these projects? You know, Joaquin, maybe if I start with you, you're nodding, you know, you're probably pretty busy right now. And, you know, how do you think about this?
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of my recommendations, paramount recommendation, because we have seen that worldwide, that everything is coming at the same time. All the projects are being launched at the same time around the world, in Australia, in the UK, in Spain, in Canada, in the US. And that's an issue because there's not many people and resources, experienced resources to bring to those projects. And the scarcity of those specialized resources globally has significant risk to maximize the delivery of these projects. The lack of expertise can lead to having not the right design, could lead to safety issues or even to inefficiencies in the operation. So in summary, I think it's a resource gap that is crucial to close it, but it's a problem, it's an issue globally.
Yeah, Helen.
I'll just turn that on its head there, though, and talking to Roddy's earlier point about the opportunities for retraining skilled labour in local communities. I think there are fantastic opportunities. These are really long construction projects, and Malcolm earlier was also talking about some of the his projects up in the Hunter Valley, which is a large coal mining area and has been for a great many generations. So giving the opportunities for reskilling, retraining is really important for both local community buy-in and also building out a workforce for the future. I think we'll be building these projects for many decades to come. So this is really an opportunity. We've recently been working with TAFE, who is our sort of local trade training organisation, and working with them to try and map what those skill requirements are and where the skill gaps are. And you know, that's a really, really important piece as well moving forward. So again, it's academia and it's our, you know, local trades and everybody that will need to work together for the energy transition and particularly hydropower.
Great, thank you. There's a good example of where the guidance note doesn't cover. One of the questions here talks about, does the guidance note cover technical requirements around the electrical mechanical equipment design addressing power factor considerations? That is an example of a level of detail we have not gone into, However, we have spoken around, again, that comes back to the importance of setting your design parameters very early in the process and understanding the implications of the need. What is the need in the market? What are your design parameters? How does that impact both your mechanical, electrical, and civil design requirements, and therefore the constructability? So a really important point. We don't address it specifically, but we talk about how do you enable a team to come together to answer those questions. There's a general question which is around, if there's any one part of the guidance that you personally think is most relevant to developers that you are working with. The team had touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to give you one based on the sort of questions that are coming in, and then again, I'll open it to the group. A lot of the questions we're seeing here are rightly around the market and the revenues, and that very early stage, which of course is absolutely a fundamental place to start. What we'd encourage developers to think about are the other two thematics around technically de-risking the project and then moving into that risk allocation. And a lot of what you'll see in the note is we probably don't see enough thought at the earliest stages from developers in those areas. Natural, we understand why, but again, in the challenge we set ourselves for how do we genuinely de-risk to unlock this market, I think what I'd say is think more about those two other thematics. Anyone else in the group would like to comment on that?
Yeah, I just like to, so we're, you know, a lot of the, you know, the talk about, you know, cap and floor, etc. That's all about ensuring that you're able to recoup your capital investment. Okay. But how big is your capital investment is actually going to end up being determined by the other two themes. You know, whether or not you've procured things in the right way, and whether or not you've adequately priced risk that actually then comes into being. So absolutely, you have you can't focus on getting the you know the bucket of money together without knowing how big a bucket you need. So that's why the other two themes are so crucially important. But as you say, can quite often get lost in the morass of just trying to make sure that you've got a market in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question, Malcolm, I think for yourself. So it says, you mentioned substantial investment in pumped storage occurring in China. I wonder, you know, what can you say about that and any particular lessons in terms of de-risking for the rest of the world?
Well, I wish I could give sort of great insights into this, but the scale of the development in China and the hundreds of gigawatts of capacity for pumped hydro is really unique. You know, we hope we have some of the largest Chinese hydro companies are members of the IHA, and we, you know, look forward at future sessions like this to hearing from them about their experiences. But I'm afraid I can't give a you know, first-hand account of it, other than that, you know, they're doing a lot of it and we'll be learning an enormous amount. You know, the point Roddy made earlier, I think a number of speakers have made, is that this is really the second iteration of pumped hydro. It was originally built 30, 40, even longer years ago, generally to support nuclear, but always to support continuous generation, so that surplus energy would be used to pump water uphill in the middle of the night. Now, of course, the need, and then the hydro plant is used as a peaking plant during the day. Now, of course, it's turned on its head, and typically it'll be pumping water uphill during a sunny day and being used to supply the grid when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you for a question. There's a question which was talking around regulation and financial mechanisms, making sure we bring financiers on board, but also thinking about complying with environmental issues and sustainability issues. Perhaps, Rebecca, you could say a little bit about what IHA have done in this world.
Oh, we've been working as an industry trade body for nearly 30 years to cover this issue. We're actually started in 1995, November. It's our 30th anniversary next year, to really focus on environmental and sustainability issues. And as part of that, we had sort of the beginnings of what is now the Hydropower Sustainability Alliance. They are now a separate body from us, and they became independent in November of last year. But they are the secretariat of something known as the Hydropower Sustainability Standard, which covers 12 different thematic areas around environmental and sustainability governance topics, and are aligned with the IFC standards on development. And as part of this, it's now included as part of the Climate Bonds Initiative for if you want to procure CBI hydropower certification. You can do that for a finished asset. The standard includes many technical documents. So these are free to access technical guidance documents, which covers issues like, and the industry has been developing these around labor, around climate mitigation, resilience. We're very keen to promote these issues as we recognize that hydropower is a critical part of both mitigation and adaptation, and pumped storage hydropower has an incredibly important role. And one of the things that I found most interesting about some of the discussions that came out of the working group was actually looking at the embedded carbon of pumped storage hydropower. Looking to Helen, because we had some really wonderful exchanges on that, but around sort of how through its act of mitigating sort of some of the, rather than if you didn't have PSH, you might have to use a combined cycle gas turbine or another quick-fired fossil fuel generator to provide that inertia or frequency response, what have you, those ancillary services that are much needed to support and maintain the grid. And as we are seeing less fossil fuels, we're hopefully going to see less embedded carbon on the grid. And how can pumped storage hydropower support the area? Well, it's a fantastic tool, and hopefully we'll see lots more of it to support that mitigation, but also climate adaptation. So how can we support communities in climate resilience issues? But Helen, did you want to touch on that embedded carbon issue?
Yeah, look, I mean, thanks very much, Rebecca, for outlining the wonderful work of the Hydropower Sustainability Alliance. And you know, I think nowadays we're starting to see sustainability and embedded carbon become either a key project metric, and that talks to green bonds and sustainable lending and things like that. But we're also seeing local content. So I think the LTES was obviously mentioned earlier, and the Capacity Investment Scheme, another scheme in Australia. And those now in the storage space talk a lot more to local content. And, you know, generally as an investor and where governments do come in and begin to support projects more, to be able to say that capital expenditure is being used to retrain workforces, to reskill communities, and to bring economic opportunities to communities that may not have had those opportunities before is really where, you know, governments want to be spending their money. So, you know, all of those are really important, I think, factors which are often not valued at the currently, but I think the conversation is starting to shift more in that direction. And I think they'll be key in the next 3 to 5 years, and hopefully will be success factors for both the cap and floor type of contract arrangements with governments and potentially other arrangements with governments for financing.
Thank you. There's a really nice question, a comment from Peter Morrissey, which is saying, do you cover in the note that in community engagement, the outcome of a pumped storage job on megawatts doesn't mean anything to them? You know, the jobs that come are, you know, are better to be communicated. It's a great point. We don't necessarily address that head on. We do talk about, as many of us like to say, pumped storage. Hydro is not necessarily terminology that lands in the world, but rechargeable water batteries. You know, how do we use language in that community engagement can help bring people with us? So we can think about how that's worded and again put it a little bit further in the next iteration.
And this, just to cover that as well, so this is something that we through the HSA, the Hydropower Sustainability Alliance, there are some case studies where through the predecessor, the protocol, or we do have some case studies where they've focused on what has been the community impact for PSH. So we can definitely dig those out and share them. And it's something that we're very keen to note is these can have multi-purpose benefits for communities, whether it be the economic impact, the environmental. Some actually end up leaving the environment in a better situation because they're really focused on how can we maintain wildlife and biodiversity. So there are definitely things that the industry is aware of and supports. And there are definitely some case studies on our sister organization's website that you should check out.
Great, thank you. I'll do a couple more and then we'll close, conscious of your time. There's question around risk, and it would be useful to have a matrix of where risk should sit. We haven't gone that far because, of course, we're not here to advise and tell particular owners, particular jurisdictions, particular markets exactly how to do that. However, we have commented on some of the major risk areas and where we think a sensible discussion needs to be had. On that point, Rebecca mentioned of, risk should not sit with the person who manages it. Risk should be managed by the person who manages it, but it sits with the person best able to bear it. And equally, there are some questions in here around, what are the specific technical risks from feasibility to FID? And in the report, we have covered that, hopefully enough, and you'll start to see the thought process from the group as to why we think it's important to get that delivery team in early. So before I close, I'd like to just ask the group, is there anything else which hasn't been said you'd like to give a message to the group on? So I'll open up to the group, otherwise I will close. No, good. Well, on that, then again, I want to express thanks to the working group members again, multiple time zones, trying to corral many wonderful views. Again, really thank you to Rebecca and the broader IHA team. It is no easy task to get all of our thoughts down to one page. But again, I thank them all honestly for really thinking about the project first. What is the right thing for the project, the right thing for the market, to come up with recommendations we can all truly stand behind. So please, read the guidance note. Please send us your feedback. We will, as a group, be meeting again over the next months to see what more we should be putting in there, what we need to tweak. The view is probably we'll do a revision. Timing of that to be decided depending on what we think. But thank you for everybody. Big numbers today. That this market clearly matters. We really appreciate your time and we really appreciate your feedback. Thank you all.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Bye.